In the wisdom paradox, which was a long time ago, I was saying that you need to kind of engage in mental exercise, in cognitive kind of activities to keep your mind young. I still say that, but now the nature of society has changed in such a way that you are forced to engage in cognitive exercises even if you don't want to.
Hi and welcome to Future Skills, where we prepare you for a future of accelerating change. I'm your host Ludvig Sunstrom, together with Mikael Syding. With us today is Dr. Elkhonon Goldberg. He has more than 50 years of experience in the area of neuroscience and cognitive psychology. He's also an author, scientist, and a practicing clinician. In today's episode, we discuss his 3 books: The Wisdom Paradox about cognitive aging, The New Executive Brain about frontal lobes and decision making, and Creativity, which is about the future of innovation. This episode is heavy in the history of neuroscience. In the first 20 minutes, we talk about his background and his mentor Alexandr Luria, and how he escaped from Russia during the Soviet Union by taking a bold risk and spending 6 months as a hospital orderly mopping floors. After that, we talk about neuroscience and his 3 books, and where he thinks the field is going in the future, whether he thinks it's possible to model the human brain and create a general AI. Then for something completely different, he tells us the story of how he first got his idea about the 2 brain hemispheres while drinking beer with 2 pediatric doctors. And we also hear about his friendship with Oliver Sacks. And finally, Elkhonon tells us which future skills he recommends and what we can do to live more wakeful lives. Welcome to the show, Elkhonon.
Well, thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
So to begin with, what does a neuropsychologist do?
Well, neuropsychology is a field of science and also a field of clinical application, somewhere at the boundary of psychology and cognitive science and neurology. As a clinical discipline, it deals with the effects of various types of brain damage on cognition, on mental functions. As a scientific discipline, it is a study of the concerns with the studies of how the cognition is generated in the brain. So as a scientific discipline, it's sort of morphed with cognitive neuroscience.
So you actually work with patients with brain damage?
I do. I work with patients with various forms of brain damage, both as part of my research, a great deal of my research involved patients. And also as a clinician, I have a private practice where I see patients with dementia, with traumatic brain injury, etc., etc.
Okay, and how long have you done this now?
Well, I entered the field of neuropsychology in my very early 20s, so I've been doing it for more than half a century.
Wow. When did you first become interested in this?
I became interested in the brain early. As an adolescent, probably 14, 15, something like that. I became interested in the relationship between the brain and cognition, and at that time it was not obvious to me how to operationalize this interest, how to pursue this interest in practical terms. So I cast about and looked at various kind of avenues available at the time and decided that psychology might be the kind of the best entry point into this discipline.
Okay. And how did you get started then? Did you apply for a university?
And I applied to University of Moscow to the program in psychology and was accepted, and that was the beginning of the journey.
But you're also involved in like a third branch associated with this area, something called mathematical neuroscience or something in that order.
Computational neuroscience.
Computational neuroscience, yeah.
Yeah, I became interested in that even well before the term was coined. And that sort of... I was interested in the mind, and from very relatively early on, the configuration of my interest was slightly unusual. I mean, most people who are interested in mathematics are interested also in physics and natural science. I was not. I was interested in the humanities and in mathematics. And I was interested in the mind And whatever little I knew about psychology at the time, and we're talking about by age of 14, 15, I felt that it was a very mushy, very imprecise, very, non-scientific field. And did not feel that I wanted to pursue it as it stood then. And then I came upon some seminal work which opened my eyes to the possibility of studying the mind with precise deductive mathematical or quasi-mathematical methods. And that was really kind of an epiphany due to a sheer chance, even though, there's a saying that serendipity favors the prepared mind. I was basically idling around and kind of browsing through my father's library. And I was 14 at the time, and came upon this book by Baruch de Spinoza, the Ethics. So that was probably the starting point of my kind of evolution of my interest in the direction of what today is called computational neuroscience. And then when I entered University of Moscow, I had this second epiphany, also through sheer serendipity. Now we're talking maybe the age of 19. I was in the library of Moscow State University, again, kind of browsing through the books and papers sort of randomly, and came upon this paper by Warren McCulloch and Pitts titled Logical Calculus of Ideas and the Immanent in Nervous Activity. That was a very old paper. It was published in 1940-something, I think 1943, in a very old biophysics journal. And it was a seminal paper about neural nets, how the biological collections of biological neurons can be modeled mathematically through formal neural nets. And that was the second kind of a moment of epiphany. So this encounter with Spinoza at the age of 14 and with McCulloch and Pitts at the age of 19 or so were kind of really two inflection points in my kind of intellectual development, and also in my making decisions regarding my career path. And at that point, I decided that this is what I wanted to do, that I wanted to somehow learn how to model the brain mathematically or quasi-mathematically, and I felt that was basically the approach which was necessary for us to understand how the mind works, because every discipline is not truly mature until it acquires its theoretical arm. Okay, physics became a mature discipline also only with the invention by Newton and by Leibniz of calculus and differential equations. Without this kind of a formal mathematical apparatus, physics would not have become physics as we know it today. And I felt that something similar had to happen for psychology in order for it to become a serious, mature discipline, and at the time it did not exist. And so I wanted to do that. And so then I orchestrated a program for myself. I had to go and kind of seek some special permissions. I remember I had this orders with the rector of the University of Moscow at the time to get his permission to create for myself the joint program to remain in the Department of Psychology, this being my main field of studies, but also to take some courses in the Department of Mathematics, which at the time was one of the top in the world at University of Moscow. So I had developed this dual program in psychology and in mathematics. And that's what I wanted to do. And then my career, so neuropsychology was not on the menu, okay?
Yeah.
And then I, through, again, a set of circumstances, not of my doing, not planned, I was introduced to Luria.
So this is your mentor, Alexandr Luria.
And Alexandr Luria became my mentor, and that's how I became a neuropsychologist. But that was not my original plan.
So you talk a lot both about modeling mathematically and logically the mind, but you also talk about modeling the brain. You use the terms more or less in the same way. Could you explain a bit how you see the brain and the mind differently, and how you model the both differently?
Right. Well, of course, the mind is a product of the brain. there was a time, again, I remember not even that long ago, maybe 30 years ago, mainstream psychology, mainstream cognitive psychology, research psychologists were not only not interested in the brain, not only didn't know anything about the brain, but sort of took pride in not being interested in the brain. They thought that condition could be studied separately, and how it is that in the terminology that they used, which I always found at the time quite bizarre. And the issue of how it is implemented in the brain could be studied by somebody else. Okay. Well, these times have long passed, and today what we are encountering is a virtual fusion of the cognitive science and neuroscience. So today it's very difficult to talk about the brain and the mind and condition separately. Okay, so kind of the contemporary discourse really binds them, fuses them together, and this is how I think about this relationship.
Okay, so if we go back to your mentor, Alexandr Luria, can you tell us who was he and what did you learn from him?
Well, he was a very interesting and a very important man. He was a psychologist. He was a neuropsychologist by, according to kind of most opinions, he was, if not the founding father of neuropsychology, then certainly one of the founding fathers of neuropsychology, and very possibly among these founding fathers of neuropsychology as a discipline, he was sort of the first among equals. His contribution is probably more important than that of anybody else of the generation. He went to medical school already as an adult person in his 40s, already as a professor of psychology. So he was both a psychologist and a neurologist. Then World War II started, and he was charged with setting up rehabilitation hospitals. A whole network of hospitals was created to cater to the wounded soldiers. And Luria was put in charge of one of them to deal with people with head injuries. For the country, it was a catastrophe, but for neuropsychology, it was a goldmine, because that provided huge material for neuropsychologists to study. So Luria was running this rehabilitation hospital, and at the same time he began to study the effects began to use this material to try to answer some more basic questions about the relationship between the brain and the mind. I mean, today we have all kinds of tools at our disposal. We have neuroimaging, we have genetics, we have all this stuff, which allows us to study the relationship between the brain and the mind in healthy individuals. In those days, none of these tools existed. So the only way to understand the normative relationship between the brain and the mind was to do it in a sort of a backwards fashion, to study the effects of various forms of brain damage on cognition. So that's what she did, and helped create this discipline of neuropsychology, which has since blossomed and became a very kind of important discipline on the boundaries, as I said, of psychology and neuroscience and neurology, to study the relationship between the brain and the condition, in the normal brain and in the abnormal brain. And he was my mentor and remained my mentor, and he was we were close, and he was also kind of protecting me against all kinds of various situations. And when I decided to leave Russia, the Soviet Union, I felt obligated to protect him. And so embarked on this very convoluted route of leaving Russia in order not to implicate him and my other professors at the University of Moscow, because they would have been punished for kind of educated, a traitor to the motherland, which is how they branded people who chose not to be members of the Soviet society.
So how did you actually do it? What was the plan like to leave Russia?
Well, basically, I was a graduate student at University of Moscow when I decided to leave the Soviet Union. University of Moscow is sort of the Harvard of the Soviet Empire, which was hands down the premier university, the elite university in the Soviet Union. Had I applied the moment you applied for an exit visa, you became a persona non grata. They would have expelled me from the University of Moscow immediately, and probably would not have allowed me to emigrate anyway. So I would end up being a cab driver or something like that. And all my professors, or at least those most closely, to whom I was most closely linked, like Luria, like Neurogen, would have been reprimanded for kind of breeding in their midst a traitor to the motherland, okay? And I didn't want this to happen. And I knew that applying, and basically I was on the verge of acquiring my Ph.D. So the Soviet Union was basically a slave running operation. So the higher your educational standing, the greater your perceived value to the state, the smaller the likelihood of being allowed to get out of there. Okay, so I had to conclude that by getting my PhD, I would be undermining my already kind of a somewhat dicey chances of getting out of the country. So I decided basically to sabotage my own defense. I invented some bogus story that my parents got sick, that I needed to take a leave of absence so that I could get a job and support my family. And they let me go, and I went back to my hometown, which was Riga, right across the Baltic Sea from you. So I went home to Riga and got the lowliest job I could. I became a hospital orderly. My job was to carry bottles and to with the pharmaceuticals and to deliver cadavers to the hospital morgue and to mop floors and to do things like that. So it was a gamble. I was banking on the kind of assumption that, according to the rules which govern their decisions, whom to let out and whom not to let out of the country, people with highly educated people, graduates of places like University of Moscow, could not be let out under any circumstances. Hospital orderlies were dispensable. And this was a very interesting time. It was the time of detente. It was 1974, and the Kissinger was shuttling back and forth between Washington and Moscow, preparing Nixon's visit to Moscow. So in those situations, and they tried to put their best foot forward. You see what I'm saying? And to kind of to put up their more liberal face. So I was banking on that. I was timing my exit visa application to Nixon's visit. Okay, but still it was a gamble. And so I operated on the assumption that hospital orderlies were dispensable, and just for the sake of the town, they would let people like that out. And I knew that they would know about my background because your dossier, your file followed you everywhere in the Soviet Union. So thinking that they would not have known that before I became an orderly, I was a graduate student at University of Moscow, would have been very naive. Of course they knew that. But they were a bunch of bureaucrats. They didn't care personally. And so it was at least a 50-50 gamble, okay? They may have decided not to let me out, and then I would have remained the hospital orderly forever, or at least until the collapse of the Soviet Union. But it was a complicated story.
Yeah. So if we fast forward many years and you write this book, the Wisdom Paradox, and it would be interesting to talk about this book a bit. So to begin with, what are some differences between an old person's brain and a young person's brain?
Well, the difference is, first of all, we need to define how old is old and how young is young. Because what happens is that, brain maturation occurs along several kind of parallel themes, and different variables, different features of the brain mature at different rates. Okay, brain myelinations is what takes the longest time to mature, and the human brain is not fully myelinated until the late 20s, maybe early 30s. I'm sure that there are some individual differences. So, and then what begins to happen is that the brain begins to demyelinate sometime in the mid-50s, okay? So there is demyelination of the brain, which occurs as part of aging, and also atrophy. It takes a long time. One can think of the kind of a biological maturation of the brain as reaching its peak toward the late 20s, early 30s, and then decline starts start sometime in the 50s. So this is the sad story of my brain. But this is where the kind of the narrative about the brain and the narrative about the mind diverge a little bit.
Okay.
Because even though biologically the brain basically declines, cognitively, because of the certain skills do suffer, like certain aspects of memory suffer, for instance, certain aspects of decision-making suffer. But on the positive side, as we move through life, assuming that our life is rich in experiences and in cognitive challenges, we accumulate an arsenal of cognitive strategies, of patterns, which help us quite considerably in dealing with cognitive challenges, and they continue to bombard us. With age, we become increasingly equipped with established strategies and patterns. Which become very powerful tools in kind of a scaffolding our cognition and enabling it and making it more efficient and effective. Okay, now. But this is a story in flux, and I talk about the morphing of the story in my recent book, Creativity. Until very recently, one could acquire a body of knowledge in your young age and basically coast on this knowledge for the rest of your life, okay? An engineer or a doctor could acquire a certain body of professional knowledge at the university at the age of 20-something, and then practice his or her trade with the reliance on that knowledge the rest of his life, or her life. So the rate of innovation was not that high. If you kind of go back at the history of human civilization, basically the rate of innovation used to be the slope of kind of the curve with which innovation was introduced into society that changed over time. It was increasing through human history. Okay, if you look at antiquity, the age of Egyptian pyramids, like 2500 BC or something like that, and the age of the Great, like 12 or 13, I forget, let's say 1300 BC. So we're talking about the span of 1200 years, okay? Mm-hmm. So in the span of 1200 years, there was virtually no change in society, okay? Now, think of the span of 1200 years now, okay? This is the time span between the collapse of the Roman Empire and the age and the Industrial Revolution. Huge change. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. So and that demonstrates, in other words, somebody who lived during the age of Egyptian pyramids could be transplanted, kind of fast forward in 1200 years, or something like that, placed in the kind of around the Great Empire, and he would hit the ground running, so to speak. He would not have had that much to relearn. Okay, now imagine somebody, a Visigoth, who just burned down Rome, being transplanted into the 18th century London. He would be like on the moon, right? He would be totally befuddled. It would be a totally different world. So, and that basically demonstrates how different the slope of innovation, slope with which the new information, new concepts, new everything were introduced in society, changed from antiquity to modernity, and the slope continues to escalate.
Yeah, changing. Okay, and this forces novelty upon everybody in society, even old people.
Exactly, and that was not the case even two generations ago. Okay, it was probably already somewhat of a case one generation ago, but 2 or 3 generations ago it was not the case. Okay, now in other words, you could learn and acquire a certain body of knowledge and concepts, and they did not change that much. You could kind of rely on them for the rest of your life. Now you see all these old people with cell phones, with computers, using the internet. I'm 71. I did not grow up with the internet. I did not grow up with mobile phones. I did not grow up with computers. Okay, so I had no concept of what we are doing this very moment, using internet for this type of communication. The rate of innovation is has changed exponentially, and that basically upended, or is a process of upending, some of the things which I was talking about in the wisdom paradox. Okay, it is less and less possible to kind of rely in the old age of this library arsenal of accumulated templates and accumulated patterns and strategies. It's still possible to a degree, but the modern doctor has to constantly update his knowledge.
Okay, so one way to interpret this is that it's becoming more important to choose what to specialize in, because you don't know if it's going to be valid 10 or 20 years from now.
Well, yes, but even there, we really have very little idea of how our chosen fields of professional fields will morph, how they will evolve.
Right.
So we often talk about various tips and tricks for staying young and keeping the brain healthy. But what you're saying almost implies that you don't really need to think about it that actively because it's done automatically.
Correct. You are forced to encounter novelty, volens knowledge, whether you like it or not. That's exactly what I'm saying in my new book, Creativity. In the wisdom paradox, which was a long time ago, I was saying that you need to kind of engage in mental exercise, in cognitive kind of activities to keep your mind young. I still say that, but now the nature of society has changed in such a way that you are forced to engage in cognitive exercises even if you don't want to. You see what I'm saying?
It's like evolutionary pressure is speeding up.
Is there would you say there's a big difference between men and women in any respect here?
I don't think so. There are some differences in brain architecture between males and females. But these are kind of subtle variations of the same theme. These are not different themes. And these differences are actually quite interesting. I talk about it in some of my research papers, in my books. The architecture of long pathways is somewhat different. In females, the two hemispheres are better interconnected. In males, the front and back of the same hemisphere, the frontal lobes and the posterior cortex, are better interconnected. So, for instance, it's one such difference. The cognitive ramifications of these changes are not clear. And again, I think that one can kind of speculate ad nauseam about what they are ultimately. And frankly, we don't even know for sure whether these differences are sex differences or gender differences, whether these are differences which are intrinsically biological differences or whether they are consequences of somewhat different kind of cultural roles that males and females still play in society. And the way to ascertain that is to see whether these architectural differences are present already in infancy, and we don't have such studies. All the available studies are about the adult brain. To see if they are present in other species, that would be very interesting, and we don't have such studies. And ultimately, to conduct in silico studies, to develop computational models and see of these different types of architectures, and see whether these architectural differences lead to some kind of a computational differences, and if they do, what are these computational differences?
What are some of the what is the relationship between homeostasis and the brain?
Well, the brain can be thought of, in its narrow definition, the term homeostasis means regulation of internal physiological states of the organism, okay? Well, brain parts a role in that, plays an important role in that. Homeostasis is controlled by the hypothalamus to a very large extent, to some extent also by the brainstem, but particularly by the hypothalamus. So different brain structures play a role, particularly the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, play a role in maintaining homeostasis in its kind of a narrow definition. In the broader sense, by homeostasis you mean, if you kind of broader the definition of homeostasis, if by homeostasis you mean coordinating and optimizing the relationship between various different variables which kind of in your life. Well, the brain is a mechanism of maintaining this growth homeostasis.
So it's threatened by change and wants to stay the same and can detect these changes.
Or dynamically adapts to change.
Right.
In other words, the function of homeostasis is, of course, to keep the vital variables within optimal ranges. But it's also a function of homeostasis to maybe modify these ranges as the environment changes.
What about homeostasis and the functions of the amygdala? Since that's a protective function, but in a totally different way.
Yeah. Well, the amygdala has been implicated in in affective control, okay? And there is this kind of tabloid notion that the neocortex is rational, subcortex is emotional. That's incorrect. The amygdala operates in close synergy with the prefrontal cortex, particularly with the orbitofrontal cortex. So when we talk about emotional control, one needs to consider these frontoamygdaloid loops. So the amygdala basically contains hardwired behaviors, hardwired programs to deal with various essential situations for the organism. For instance, to deal with various threats. Some of these programs are hardwired in the sense that we are born with them, and some other such programs are hardwired in the sense that they are product of a cumulative experience during ontogeny. So this is the role of the amygdala. But this interaction between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex is extremely important because the prefrontal cortex kind of introduces a layer of kind of a rational cognitive control and modification on top of these hardwired programs. In fact, in this wisdom paradox of mine, I talk about this, you may remember this very funny experience that I had in Kenya and somewhere around Mombasa. They took me to a crocodile farm. I'm not even sure whether they were crocodiles or alligators. One or the other, okay? So they took me to this crocodile farm, and there was this baby alligator which just hatched, came out of his egg literally a few moments earlier, and it was kind of the length of my palm. It was skinny, clearly totally harmless creature, okay? And so they proffered it to me. I said, well, touch it. And I extended my hand to touch it, and I couldn't. There was something in me that pulled literally. There was this physical experience of my hand being pulled away from this creature from my hand. Something inside me physically resisted my attempt to extend my hand and to touch this little creature, which was obviously harmless. And I tried, and they couldn't. And they ended up not being able to touch it. And that was clearly this contest between my amygdala, which probably contains some hardwired programs to avoid certain creatures, and my frontal lobes, which were telling me that rationally that this little baby crocodile was completely harmless. And in that instance, the amygdala won. The amygdala prevailed. And I have a dog. I have an English Mastiff. He's right here in the office. His name is Brutus. And with Brutus, I observed some very interesting behaviors, also demonstrating the hardwired nature of some of these programs, which are presumably somehow managed and housed in the amygdala. I mean, once we walked down the street, and there was a hose, the hose with which they're just hosing the street, kind of cleaning the street, the sidewalk, and it was coiled. And Brutus stopped and pulled away from this coiled hose. Why? Because I think that usually I'm pretty sure that was the first time he encountered such an object, and he was scared by this object. And I think that that they have some hardwired programs to stay away from snakes. And this coil looked like a snake. Yeah, you see what I'm saying? This coiled hose looked like a snake, like a big snake, and he tried to run away from it.
What breed is he, and how large is he?
He is an English Mastiff, and he weighs like 85 kilos or 86 kilos, something like that. So
That's really big. Yeah.
Yeah. Before him, I had Brit, who was a bull mastiff. He was a little smaller. He probably weighed 72, 75 kilos. Yeah.
That's still big.
Right. Yeah. It must be pretty amazing, though, to see you walk that dog, and the dog gets scared by like some kind of a cable or hose.
Yeah, well, in that instance, he got scared. But being a neuroscientist, I think I understood what was going on. I'm pretty sure that it was that this hardwired kind of a program kicked in response to an object which looked like a snake.
And how much do you think can be done about both pre-programmed amygdala reactions and learned amygdala reactions?
Well, with respect to this pre-programmed, I don't know how much can be done. I would imagine that with some great effort and training, I would have learned how to overcome my aversion to baby alligators, and touched him eventually. Well, in psychology, this is precisely about the interplay between the amygdala and the frontal lobes. I mean, the frontal lobes introduces a rational component in this interplay between the rote emotion and the rational thought, and they may play an important role. I mean, there are some interesting data, just to kind of segue into something slightly different but related, about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a very acute and severe emotional reaction to some adverse experience. Okay. The people with more developed cognition, measured according, in the existing research as IQ, are less susceptible to the effects, are less likely to develop PTSD. In other words, if two individuals are introduced to the same potentially traumatic event, the more intelligent person is less likely to develop PTSD.
Huh. So I have one final question about the wisdom paradox.
Yeah.
And it is about the concept that you give in the book. And this was my biggest takeaway from the book.
Yeah.
And it is the 4 seasons of brain age.
Uh-huh.
And the reason that I found this very enlightening was because it gave me a framework for planning ahead in life, so that I knew how to use different parts of my life better.
How old are you?
I'm 27 now.
Uh-huh. We have a long way to go. Good.
So could you tell us a little bit about these 4 seasons of brain age?
Well, during the season of brain development, during the season of which, as I said, we're not talking about the kind of a binary discontinuities. So it's kind of a idle, any attempt to impose some very strict boundaries between these chronological boundaries between these seasons is, in my opinion, would be misguided. But somewhere between the early to late 20s is when there is this transition, or maybe late 20s, when there is this transition from the developing brain to a mature brain. Somewhere between the late 20s to, late 50s, early 60s. Again, these boundaries, first of all, are subject to individual differences, and secondly, are probably culture dependent as well. That's another very interesting subject. So, but this would be the age of cognitive and biological and cognitive maturity, and then there is the age of the cognitive age of aging, which is characterized by certain decay of the brain, but again subject to a wide range of individual differences. What I'm about to say may be a flippant statement to make, but that's how I honestly feel. I'm 71, almost 72. I don't feel that my condition has declined over the last 10 or 20 years. I really don't. I feel that flawed as it was 20 years ago, it remained as it was then, okay? I don't experience myself as in a state of cognitive decline. It may be an illusion or a delusion, but that's how I honestly feel, okay? So this is all subject to individual differences, obviously. But from a biological standpoint, I'm sure that my brain is in decline. But at least for now, despite this very rapid rate of with which innovation is introduced, novelty is introduced, still it's possible to a very large extent to benefit from these established patterns and strategies. And I guess I'm a beneficiary of that. And so by the ageless brain, I meant precisely that the ability to withstand the effects of biological natural aging of the brain because of this accumulation of kind of cognitive tools, broadly speaking. But as we just established in our conversation a few minutes earlier, this may no longer be the case, and the society is increasingly injected with novelty at ever faster and faster rate. But and I refer to this phenomenon in my new book, Creativity, at the end of autopilot. That to the extent that in a relatively informationally static society, one could benefit from this mental autopilot, and the more of these autopilots you accumulated, the better you could coast. Okay, now we are experiencing increasingly the end of autopilot because we are forced to constantly acquire some novel stuff. Okay, and so that may change the nature of this fourth season. The ageless brain may no longer be ageless, but it confers some other benefits. Again, in this new book of mine, Creativity, I discuss a very interesting trends which nobody anticipated, at least I didn't anticipate. Namely, that the incidence of dementia is decreasing both in the United States and in a number of European countries. There was a study in the Netherlands, I know. I think there was in Sweden too, I'm not sure. There was one in the United Kingdom showing that the incidence of the rate with which dementia develops is coming down, and also at the age at which dementia strikes is increasing by something like 5 years. So that means, and nobody can explain this phenomenon fully, okay? At least in part, I'm sure it can be explained by the medical advancement that, physical well-being is better now than it was a few generation ago, and the ability to treat various neurological diseases is better. But when researchers try to control for these various obvious factors like the greater ability to control blood pressure, greater ability to control cholesterol, all this stuff, still they could not account for this phenomenon of kind of a decreased incidence of dementia and increased age at which it strikes you, okay? And in this new book of mine, I propose, it's strictly speculative and no empirical evidence to support it, but just as a kind of a hypothesis, I propose that this phenomenon is really a beneficial effect of the digital world. Okay, that our life is increasingly digital, and these digital tools which affect our life are constantly changing, and the new tools are being constantly introduced, and as we already established, knowledge, people have to learn them, and so while kind of depriving us of the mental autopilot, it forces us to engage in cognitive exercises, as one of you pointed out, not as a matter of kind of a contrived formal activities, but you have to do that just to live your life, okay? And that may have a biologically protective effect on the brain.
Do you think it's equally good for children as it is for older people?
I think so. I definitely think so. And there's debate about whether the internet and all these digital tools are good or bad. It's an idle debate. It doesn't matter because it's coming anyway. Whether it's good or bad, it's here. You know what I'm saying?
There's a lot of money being made too.
Yeah, so it's here. And I think that on balance it's good. Like with everything else, you can find some evil applications of every innovation. Okay, and we have seen how social media was exploited to manipulate elections, to spread some misinformation. Evil organizations like Al-Qaeda, like ISIS, were basically thriving because of social media that they were able to sell, etc., etc. So yes, there is a downside to it, but there is a downside to every upside. Okay, I think that on the whole, it's a very salutary development. And as I said a minute ago, it doesn't matter because it's here and it's going to expand. And so whether it's good or bad doesn't matter. It's here.
Okay. So in summary, all of these technological improvements and gadgets and the accelerating change, it's putting more evolutionary pressure on us, and it's also forcing more novelty into our lives, and that activates the prefrontal cortex more.
Yeah, activate the whole brain, particularly the prefrontal cortex at the right hemisphere. Yeah.
Okay, so what could be some other ways to activate the prefrontal cortex? if I wanted to do it, I wanted to live a lifestyle where I try to use it as much as possible?
Well, expand your exposure to novelty and to cognitive challenges.
How about, for example, variation?
And that too, these cognitive challenges should be diverse. Yeah.
Or randomness. Like Mikael, for example, he's an investor and has been in many different fields. So then he sees all these different random examples of things that...
Well, I don't know about randomness, diversity. Let's say diversity.
Okay. Is there anything else that comes to mind?
Well, I think that's enough. Well, physical well-being. I think that physical well-being is very important. I know about myself, that in order for me to think clearly, I have to have a sense of physical well-being. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
when I'm sick, when I'm tired, when I have a bit of a hangover, the quality of my thinking suffers. Okay?
We have talked a lot about creativity and health, but not really about happiness. Do you think these are completely intertwined, or are they totally different? How are you with happiness?
Well, I need to decide happiness. Who knows? I don't. There is a very interesting relationship between happiness and novelty. And I talk about it in the wisdom paradox. Okay, that in order to embark on some kind of an exploration, in fact, creativity is propelled by a sense of dissatisfaction. You see what I'm saying?
It's like being a manic depressive who have ups and downs.
Or at least cyclothymic. Yes. So if you are perfectly satisfied with the status quo, then there is no impetus to embark on any creative pursuits. In the Wisdom Paradox, I have this chapter titled Magellan on Prozac, kind of a humorous way, sort of speculating that had Prozac existed during the time of Great Mariner, then Columbus and Magellan would be just popping up Prozac and sitting in Cordoba and not bothering going to exploring the world.
Mm-hmm.
So the relationship between happiness and this being driven to novelty, being driven to creativity is a tricky one. You see what I'm saying? If you are in a state of depression, then the severe depression, of course, is paralyzing. But there is some literature to suggest that cyclothymic kind of a condition, in other words, where the kind of periods of kind of a happiness are intertwined with periods of kind of a sadness, may in fact be conducive to creativity. So it's a very interesting relationship. It's not a simple one.
Yeah, I've actually read about that. I've read 2 books about cyclothermia, and I believe that, what you're saying.
Yeah.
I want to talk about a little bit about your book, The New Executive Brain, Frontal Lobes in a Complex World. So to begin with, could you explain your term executive intelligence?
Right. Executive functions is the term that is commonly used. Executive functions are functions linked to the frontal lobes, broadly speaking, and it's not a unitary construct. It's a whole array of functions necessary to organize behavior and drive it toward kind of in a goal-directed, coherent way. Okay, so this is the genesis of this term executive functions, by analogy with the chief executive officer. Okay, chief executive officer doesn't do anything in particular. He or she directs activities of other people, right? So this is what executive functions are. I personally, this term was introduced many years ago, before I kind of entered the field, sometime in the 60s.
Okay.
I personally like the analogy with the orchestra conductor even better. And in my books, I recount an episode, which is a true episode. It may sound too cute to be true, but it is true. From my own childhood, when I was 4 or 5 years of age, my mother decided that it was time to introduce me to high culture. And she took me to a matinee in the opera house in Riga, where I was growing up. And it was Swan's Lake, this famous great ballet by Tchaikovsky, right? Yeah. And I remember we were sitting in one of the tiers, looking down at the stage, and I have these vivid memories of the episode. And there were people dancing on the stage, and there were these musicians playing their instruments in the orchestra, and I was completely mesmerized by this little guy who was standing on the podium waving his hands. And I couldn't understand what he was doing. I was 4 years old or 5 years old. I could understand what the dancers were doing. They were dancing. I could understand what the musicians were doing. They were playing their instruments. For the life of me, I could not figure out what this funny guy was doing, standing there and waving his hands. And that was, of course, the orchestra conductor, okay? So I couldn't figure it out. I spent these 2 hours staring at, ignoring everything else, staring at this little guy, trying to figure out what the hell he was doing, okay? It was not obvious to me. It's a true story. And I have vivid recollections of that. So this is what what executive functions are, because it took psychologists and neuroscientists many years to appreciate to recognize their existence and to appreciate link them to the frontal lobes and to appreciate the importance of the frontal lobes. Because, traditionally the field was dedicated to trying to figure out trying to understand specific cognitive skills. What are the mechanisms of reading? What are the mechanisms of writing? What are the mechanisms of speaking? What are the mechanisms of listening? So this idea that in addition to these kind of special cognitive skills, there is a certain aspect of cognition which is in charge of coordinating all of the above, and was not a self-evident, not an obvious idea to come by, okay? And it took the field of psychology, of neuroscience, many years to arrive at this notion, and for many years the frontal cortex was ignored and was regarded as basically superfluous. And it was only sometime in the second half of the 20th century that people became interested in the frontal lobes and interested in executive function. And of course, now it's all the rage. I mean, now of all the aspects of cognition, executive functions are probably the most studied. But that's a relatively recent, by recent I mean it's a phenomenon of the last 40 years, let's say.
In this book, the foreword is written by Oliver Sacks, right?
Yeah.
Did the two of you know each other?
We were very close friends, actually.
How did you meet?
We met many years ago. He was about 15 years older than I. And we met at a party at the medical center where I worked at the time. And so I was there as a faculty member, and he was invited to that party, and we just struck a conversation, and we liked each other. And from that point, we had an uninterrupted kind of a relationship since the late 70s till his death 3 years ago. So practically for 40 years, almost 40 years.
Okay. And he was also a very famous neuroscientist. I'm wondering, did you ever collaborate on anything?
We not in a technical sense, in that he did not, when I met him, he was not conducting formal research. He did some research in his younger years, with this famous work, research of his with sleeping encephalitis and the dopamine agonist in sleeping encephalitis. That was the basis for his book Awakenings and for the film, for the movie. But by the time we met, he was no longer doing formal research. He was mostly a writer and clinician. So no, we never did any formal research together, but we discussed things all the time. He was influential in several kind of studies, research projects of mine, not by dint of being a collaborator, but because I discussed it with him, and he was a very insightful man, so he gave some good advice. And I suspect that this whole activity of mine, of writing these books, he was, in some sense, a role model embarking on this activity. Well, first of all, of course, he was a much better writer. But generally, as that aside, his books were more popular than mine. Even when I tried to write a popular book, the scientist in me sort of undermined this intent, and the book comes out more technical than the original plan would have been, right? So my books kind of straddled this fence between popular and scientific. The idea is that it would appeal to both most kind of a high-level general audience like you gentlemen, and also to the professional scientific audience, how well I meet this goal, I have no idea. Whereas his books are clearly designed for the general public. But he was clearly a very influential presence in my life in many ways. And we were close friends.
Okay. Speaking of writing popular books, do you believe one of the reasons his books did become popular was because he chose compelling case studies and told good stories? Or
yeah, absolutely, no question about it. That's what made his reputation. But then he was a very erudite man, and he was a good thinker. So his books are more than just parlaying these clinical anecdotes in a kind of in a graphic way, but he embedded them in some very thoughtful discussions, and he was really a phenomenally erudite man. So he was able to embed it in all kinds of historic discussions of the history of science, history of medicine, which put them, kind of elevated them at a totally different level.
Is that the dog?
That's Brutus.
That was Brutus. You just heard Brutus. Yeah.
You came up with this idea that the right side of the brain deals with novelty and the left side deals with routine tasks. Could you tell us something about the implications this would have for example, brain damage to either side of the brain, and maybe also in terms of if you're not exposed to novelty and thus the brain maybe ages quicker, is that more detrimental to the right side than to the left?
Let me start with the second half of your question. The short answer is yes. And if you recall the wisdom paradox, I conduct some review of existing studies which actually show that the right hemisphere begins to atrophy at an earlier age, as part of aging, than the left hemisphere. There are all kinds of neuroimaging studies which basically can measure relative sizes of different parts of the brain. In fact, some of my own work involved such studies. So there is some body of evidence, not my evidence, but, accrued by other people, demonstrating that the right hemisphere begins to succumb to the effects of age-related atrophy before the left hemisphere. And I think that it's at least in part because, until recently, again, things are in flux now, but until recently, with aging was associated with decreased exposure to novelty, right? In the kind of a traditional scheme of things, as you were getting older, your life was increasingly driven by established routines. You are less, unless there were some societal cataclysms around you, you were less exposed to novelty. And I think that this accounts for the fact that the right hemisphere ages before the left hemisphere, and also the frontal lobes are subject to the effects of atrophy before other parts of the brain. In this age of novelty, and this is again something that I discussed in the new book, Creativity book. Again, it's strictly speculative, but I'm discussing how this age of novelty, which is upon us, may have profound implications on how the brain ages and these protective effects against dementia. So this phenomenon whereby the right hemisphere ages before the left hemisphere may be affected by increased exposure to novelty, okay? But at least, until relatively recently, based on the studies conducted 10 years, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, it appeared that the right hemisphere was subject to atrophy at a faster rate in aging than the left hemisphere. Now, this whole idea basically occurred to me many years ago. I was still a student at University of Moscow. And it occurred to me because this whole notion, I found this notion linking the traditional notion, still the dominant notion, linking the left hemisphere to language and the right hemisphere to visual spatial processes. I found it incomplete. Why? Because it has no meaning outside of our species. You see what I'm saying? This distinction between verbal functions and non-verbal functions is only applicable to species in possession of language, which is the human species. And that I felt could not be the whole story, because the brains of other animals also consist of two hemispheres, okay? And generally I felt that one should explore the possibility of evolutionary continuities before you settle on an idea which is that some fundamental feature of the brain exists which is unique to humans, okay? So I was kind of groping, thinking about something which would be more general, some principle which would be applicable across species, and came up with this notion that the one hemisphere is in charge of novelty and the other hemisphere is in charge of cognitive routines. Basically, again, it was a serendipity of sorts. Right? It was on my mind, but again, there's this notion that serendipity favors the prepared mind. I was having beer. I was friends. Luria's lab I was a student at the University of Moscow, but Luria's lab was placed at this huge Institute of Neurosurgery, Bordenko Institute of Neurosurgery, and that's where, I was cutting my teeth in the field as one of his kind of associates. I became friendly with two pediatric neurosurgeons. They were also young guys, older than I was, probably around in my early 20s. They were maybe in their early 30s, mid-30s, and one day we just went together to have beer, okay? And so we're sitting here and drank beer, and they were telling me about some puzzling observation that they were making, because they were saying that they were taught in medical school that damage to the left hemisphere is much more catastrophic than damage to the right hemisphere, okay? The damage to the left hemisphere can lead to all kinds of profound cognitive change, deficits, impairment, but damage to the right hemisphere less so. But they were saying in little children, they were observing the opposite. So they were pediatric neurosurgeons, so they were treating children with tumors, with all kinds of horrible things, they were saying that in children, they were encountering the opposite. The damage to the left hemisphere was less fraught with catastrophic consequences for mental functions, whereas damage to the right hemisphere was fraught with really catastrophic the consequences for the cognitive function. And that was not even the product of some formal research. It was just their informal observation, and they were just mentioning that, by the way, they were talking about all kinds of things, and by the way, how can you explain that? What do you make out of these funny phenomena? And that immediately kind of resonated with this already predating kind of a skepticism about this linking left hemisphere to language and right hemisphere to visual spatial functions. And so I thought that maybe it's because for the little children, the world is novel. For adults, the world is already to a large extent familiar. Okay? So I thought that maybe it's because the right hemisphere is more important for dealing with cognitive novelty. And the left hemisphere is kind of a very repository of cognitive routines. That I thought would explain this disparity between the observations of relative effects of lateralized tumors in adults versus lateral lesions, broadly speaking, with adults versus children. Okay, so that's what gave rise to the whole notion. And then I sort of put this idea on hold because then it was time for me to get out of the Soviet Union. Then when I settled in New York, I planned some research along these lines and also conducted some literature reviews and basically found a lot of support in the literature for this idea, and then began to publish papers on promoting this notion. So that's how it happened. I think that the main implications are in the realm of kind of fundamental neuroscience, that it really places this whole notion of hemispheric specialization in a broader evolutionary context, because as I said earlier, just linking language, left hemisphere to language and the right hemisphere to non-verbal functions, I mean, this notion is only applicable to our species. It cannot be applied to other species because the other species don't have language, okay? So, which makes it very limited. And so, in my new book, Creativity, I have a whole chapter titled In the Baboon Creative, where I conduct a very systematic review of hemispheric differences in other species, in mammalian species, in birds, even in invertebrates. And basically it appeared that this distinction between this division of roles, linking novelty to one half of the brain and the routines to the other half of the brain, is a very fundamental feature of the central nervous system across the mammalian species, but even outside of the mammalian world, in avians, in birds, and even in invertebrates. So it appears to be a very fundamental distinction which has been either conserved across evolution or is a product of what is called convergent evolution, whereby the different evolutionary kind of a strands arrive at the same principle independently because it's so adaptive.
Huh.
And basically now it finds support in artificial intelligence, because in the world of neural nets, for instance, artificial neural nets, they encounter this big conundrum that it's very difficult to design a neural net which would at the same time be able to acquire new knowledge and preserve old information, okay? Because what very often happens in these devices, as new information is acquired, as a result of that, representation of previously acquired information is degraded, okay? So, and one of the solutions that some of the important players in that world, kind of pioneers in neural net research, proposed is that you need to separate these two activities in the net. So maybe Mother Nature, evolution, came upon this principle long time ago, and this may be one of the evolutionary pressures which led to the bicameral brain with certain types of specializations, linking one half to novelty, the other one to cognitive routines. Because for strictly computational reasons, it appears to confer this kind of a separation of these two activities appears to confer some computational advantage.
And that idea also ties in perfectly with what you keep repeating about serendipity coming to the prepared.
Yeah.
So what do you think is the future of neuroscience? What's going to happen in the next 10 or 20 years?
Who knows? That's precisely the thrill of it, that things develop at such a net-breaking pace that it's impossible to predict. But I think that what will happen is the fusion of, well, not fusion, but increasing interaction between neuroscience and mathematics and computer science, that neuroscience will develop its theoretical arm, either in the form of certain kind of the fields of mathematics or in the field of computer simulation, what they call in silico, or both. And I think that this will be the single most important development in neuroscience. And that will enrich our understanding of the brain, because, the brain is such a complex and such a non-linear system that you could learn only so much through experiments. You see what I'm saying? You can stick only so many electrodes in a rat's brain before you kill it. Ultimately, we need some detailed, complex models, so through kind of a current terminology, in silico approach, to understand these complex nonlinear interactions. So I think that will be this interface will enrich neuroscience. It will also enrich artificial intelligence. There is a movement in the world of artificial intelligence toward what they call artificial general intelligence. In other words, up to this day, we've witnessed great progress in AI devices, but most of them have been dedicated. Do you see what I'm saying? Dedicated to a particular, very parochial type of activity. Face recognition, voice recognition, playing chess, playing Go. These activities are very complex, but they're parochial. You see what I'm saying? Whereas a biological brain is a multiple purpose machine. And so now there is a growing interest in the AI community in developing devices which would possess this open-ended general capability, the capabilities which would enable them to develop a potentially, open-ended array of abilities and skills, as opposed to being kind of narrowly dedicated to something in particular. Okay, and they realize that they may have a lot to learn. That the evolution has solved this problem by designing the biological brain. Okay, and so they are very interested, or at least some of them are very interested in neuroscience. I've been asked to consult for a company in Australia, a team which develops general intelligence, artificial general intelligence devices. So I think that the interface between neuroscience and kind of artificial intelligence community will grow and will be very beneficial to both.
Are you familiar with Ray Kurzweil's idea of making a modeling a brain?
Well, I'm generally familiar with his ideas. Yeah.
Okay. Do you believe it's possible to build a neocortex like that?
In principle, yes. It's not around the corner. These Australian friends of mine are trying to do something like that, okay? It's a long way. In principle, yes.
Okay, so I have one final question, and that's what future skills do you think will become more important as we go into the future? For example, for young people to learn or people earlier in their career?
Computer-related skills. Programming and various software and the related skills have become as important as having the command of these skills has become as important as literacy in the conventional sense. People of my generations don't have it, but people of your generations have it increasingly, and people of the forthcoming generation of kids who are now 2 or 3 or 5 years of age, which is kind of the next generation after yours, your two generations, will have it. And I think that this is by far the most important skill set that people will need to have.
I can see how you either need to be quite proficient in computer science, or you need to be good at making fire and hunting in the woods. They're two different futures.
Exactly. But considering that the woods are disappearing, the second choice is becoming increasingly limited.
So one last thing here, and that is, where can people go if they want to find out more about you, learn what you do, maybe get your books?
Well, you can go on Amazon and buy my books. And, I think that you'll find both the new executive brain interesting. It's a significant change relative to the original executive brain. It's expanding. It's considerably expanding. And I talk there about artificial intelligence and all these things, and particularly the creativity book. You'll find them interesting.
All right. It was a delight talking to you, and thank you so much for giving us so much of your time.
Yeah.
Okay, it has been a pleasure, and thank you for your interest.
All right, that's it for today. A big thanks to Alexander Martin, who is our editor and sound guy. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter and leave a review on iTunes. We would really appreciate it.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Bye.